Bayou's Horrifying Secret, Part 5. The restlessness of the Bayou night was palpable. Despite the pressing need to rest, neither Ash nor I could find a moment's respite. The chase had led us deeper into the swamp, but Lupin's trail had vanished as if swallowed by the mire itself. As dawn's first light broke over the horizon, we found ourselves back at the makeshift command post, poring over boxes of evidence. We began the painstaking process of consolidating the evidence we had gathered so far. We worked relentlessly, fueled by Teresa's anguish and the ticking clock. Drawing upon my NOPD experience and master's in forensic psychology, I began to create a comprehensive criminal profile. The piles of evidence seemed to stare back at me, challenging me to make sense of them. Each piece, from the haunting Polaroid of Claire to the locket, was a testament to Lupin's twisted psyche. Several factors pointed towards Lupin being a native of the region, perhaps even having a deep-rooted connection to the Bayou itself. His intimate knowledge of the terrain and ability to disappear into it were evidence of this. His methods had always been sophisticated, hinting at an intimate knowledge of human anatomy. His proficiency in dispatching his victims was almost surgical. The manner in which he eluded capture showcased a mind that reveled in the macabre, tormenting his victims and their families long after their deaths. This was not just about killing. It was a game, one he enjoyed immensely. Not only did he have a way of making the murders look accidental or like suicides, but he also seemed to have a clear preference for victims, young brunettes of Cajun descent. He was intelligent and adept in both physical pursuits and intellectual challenges. The nature of the crimes suggested a familiarity with medicine. Piecing this together with the fact that most of his victims were pregnant teens led me to a chilling hypothesis. Lupin was luring these girls under the guise of providing medical aid, most likely abortions, only to turn their desperate circumstances into a twisted game. Ash and I compiled a list of medical professionals in the region who matched our profile, narrowing it down by age, specialty, and other relevant factors. After hours of painstaking research, cross-referencing, and elimination, only one name remained on our list: Ranier Delacroix, a prominent surgeon who had become a recluse in 2010 for nebulous medical reasons. Quiet talk suggested a hereditary mental condition that had perhaps forced him out of mainstream practice. It was an unsettling yet oddly fitting element, given the sadistic games Lupin enjoyed. Delacroix fit the profile almost too perfectly. He matched Lucien's physical description. His timeline aligned almost seamlessly with the series of crimes, and the dark cloud of his sudden retreat from medicine only added to our suspicions. Moreover, he had grown up in this Bayou region, which explained his almost supernatural ability to navigate its treacherous terrain. Despite having narrowed down our suspect list to Ranier Delacroix, a new problem emerged. Nobody actually knew his current whereabouts. His family was estranged, former colleagues knew nothing, and the local authorities had no recent records of him. It was as if he'd vanished into the very swamp we suspected him of haunting. In the midst of our search, a pattern in the disappearances began to crystallize. Overlaying the locations of Lupin's suspected activities on a map, a circle formed, encompassing a specific remote area of the Bayou. It was as if he was operating out of a central location, a hidden lair. My mind raced back to Gabby, whose mysterious voicemail had included cryptic mentions of the face of the Bayou and blood moon on the water. I revisited the sketches in Gabby's notebook, haunting drawings of twisted trees, jagged landmarks, and an eerily detailed full moon reflecting over a body of water. In a moment that felt more like divine intervention than deductive reasoning, it clicked. Connecting the dots between the sketches and the mapped disappearances, I speculated that the face of the Bayou Gabby referenced might be a specific landmark or topographical feature. Given the detailed drawing of the moon reflecting on water, I guessed that this face was likely a body of water with a distinctive shape or pattern. Using satellite images and topographical maps of the Bayou, we zeroed in on a uniquely crescent-shaped pond, eerily resembling a face when illuminated by the moon, with the full moon's reflection forming an eye. We hypothesized that this face was the location Gabby alluded to in her voicemail. Further research revealed an obscure piece of Bayou folklore about the Blood Moon Pond. Locals believed that during certain times of the year, the pond's waters turned a deep blood-red hue under the full moon. It was a long shot, but the best one we had. As I sat there digesting the gravity of our findings, I realized that the noose was tightening. We had a name, a face, and enough circumstantial evidence to move forward. I stared at Lupin's photo. As I peered into the abyss that was his marsh green eyes, the abyss seemed to peer back at me. Armed with a growing body of evidence and a newfound sense of purpose, Ash and I began preparations for what could be the final encounter with Lupin. As I checked each piece of equipment, my mind couldn't shake off the thought of how uncannily agile and fast Lupin had shown himself to be. The way he navigated the treacherous bayou, the way he seemed to disappear into the shadows. It all seemed almost supernatural. Chilling tales from my childhood infiltrated my thoughts. "Ash," I began, "do you know what a rougarou is?" My voice was heavier than I'd intended. He glanced at me, his normally steely eyes reflecting a hint of uncertainty. "No. Am I supposed to?" "It's like the Cajun werewolf. Something parents tell kids to get them to behave," I explained, realizing how ridiculous I sounded as soon as the words left my mouth. Okay. What does that have to do with anything?" Ash asked, perplexed. "There's something about Lupin, the way he moves, how he disappears. It's just unnatural," I admitted, recalling my brief but terrifying encounters with him. Ash paused, assessing the implications. "You think he's, what, some kind of monster?" "I don't know. Maybe there's a hint of truth in those tales. Maybe there's something more to him than just a deranged human," I replied. Ash cocked his Benelli M4 shotgun, letting the sound punctuate the silence. "Well, whether he's a man or monster, anything can be taken down with enough bullets." The sentiment was reassuring, and I couldn't help but agree. Regardless of Lupin's true nature, our resolve was unwavering. We were there to put an end to his reign of terror once and for all. As Ash tightened the straps on his tactical vest, I moved towards the table that held our arsenal. My eyes locked onto the AR-15. Picking up the firearm, I felt a surge of conflicting emotions. In my hands, the gun weighed not just in pounds, but also in memories, haunting echoes of my past, where the line between justice and violence seemed to blur more often than I'd like to admit. Closing my eyes momentarily, I could see each of the victims' faces, forever frozen in time. My fingers involuntarily squeezed the rifle harder. I could feel my pulse quicken, the familiar burn of tears threatening to spill. What consumed me now, even more than the desire to find Gabby, was a fiery, unyielding bloodlust. The rawness of that emotion was almost overpowering. The desire for vengeance burned in my veins, a yearning that I hadn't known I was capable of feeling. Delacroix's hideout fell within Vermilion Parish, a region of the bayou that was particularly isolated and difficult to navigate. It was as if the land itself had conspired to shield Lupin's dark activities from the prying eyes of justice. Getting there would be a challenge. We rented an airboat from a local outfitter who, despite asking no questions, clearly sensed the urgency in our demeanor. Navigating through the bayou was like threading a needle with a blindfold on. If the eye of the needle was shifting, floating on murky water, and guarded by gnarled trees that reached out like wraiths. As the airboat hummed softly through the bayou, Ash retrieved the drone from its case. A compact machine equipped with the latest in infrared technology, the drone was designed to pick up heat signatures even in the most challenging environments. Taking a moment to calibrate, Ash sent the drone skyward. Its whirring blades were soon muffled by the thick canopy overhead. We both watched intently as the drone relayed a live feed to Ash's tablet. As it hovered above the Blood Moon Pond, the screen displayed a complex network of waterways leading to a hidden clearing, seemingly obscured from view by deliberately placed vegetation. Central to this clearing was a series of ramshackle structures made of wood and moss, half submerged in water, closed off by a fence. "Look at that." Ash's voice held a note of trepidation as a faint heat signature appeared on the screen. It was huddled and stationary, likely restrained. My gut told me it was Gabby. Ash wasted no time in formulating a tactical approach. His fingers danced over the drone controls, carefully mapping out the compound's layout and noting potential points of entry and escape routes. He assessed the landscape's topography, identifying vantage points and possible ambush locations. With the drone hovering at a safe distance, Ash pointed out the dense clusters of reeds and marshland to the compound's west. This natural barrier would mask our approach, allowing us to get close without detection. He also identified a small clearing to the east, which could serve as an emergency extraction point if things went south. Our hearts pounding, we left the airboat camouflaged under a copse of gnarled cypress trees. We'd synchronized our wristwatches, and as we navigated our way through the thickets and muddy pools, each step became an intricate dance. Measured, timed, calculated to bring us closer to the lair of an unknown adversary. A palpable tension filled the air, as stifling as the heavy humidity of the bayou itself. With night vision goggles in place and our firearms at the ready, we began our cautiously planned approach towards the compound. The reeds seemed to part reluctantly as we made our way through them, as if nature itself was warning us away. A surreal stillness permeated the environment, like we had stepped into a vacuum devoid of sound. Not a frog croaked, not an insect buzzed. Only the distant murmur of the swamp, as if it were holding its breath. With the drone's feed as our guide, we approached the compound cautiously. Ash, drawing on his Marine training as a former platoon commander in Iraq, took the lead. Moving swiftly yet silently, he deftly navigated the uneven terrain, signaling instructions with hand gestures, a language I had become fluent in during our time together. And then there it was, Lupin's compound looming out of the shadows like a dark, festering secret. The fence was camouflaged to blend into the surrounding vegetation. The entryways shadowed recesses hard to discern from natural caves. Signaling to Ash, we took positions among the dense reeds. He hunkered down in a crouch, his fingers lightly brushing the shotgun's trigger, while I took out a pair of wire cutters to sever the fence. One snip, then another, and a hole appeared just large enough for us to pass. As I stepped through the opening, an acute sense of unease washed over me, a gut instinct screaming that something was horribly amiss. The smell of decay was thick in the air, mingling with an undercurrent of something metallic, perhaps blood. We passed makeshift totems, twisted effigies made of branches, dark feathers, and what looked like human bones, silently watching our advance. Drawing ever closer to the compound's heart, each step was a deliberate choice, both to minimize noise and to strategically place ourselves out of the direct line of sight. Though the air was thick and heavy, we breathed shallowly, not wanting our breathing to give away our location. The drone had shown us that the hut was nestled next to the Blood Moon Pond, and it was this landmark that guided our advance. The moonlight filtered through the thick canopy above, casting eerie, dancing shadows upon the water's surface. We kept low, using the shadows as our cloak, our senses heightened to detect the slightest anomaly. The sudden sound of a violin pierced the heavy air, ethereal and haunting like the mournful wail of a lost soul. For a moment I thought I was imagining it, that my frayed nerves had finally crossed the line into delirium. But Ash heard it too. His eyes met mine, and a single nod confirmed that the music was real. We moved towards the sound, our weapons ready, and yet each step was taken with an almost reverential care, as if not to disturb the lament that unfolded in the form of delicate violin notes. With each stride, the aroma of decay and rust seemed to give way to the scent of damp wood and fresh soil, almost as if we were walking into a different world entirely. There by the lake, bathed in the ghostly light of the moon, was Gabby, huddled on the ground. Her posture was that of a broken bird, a tattered angel with clipped wings. She was gagged, her hands bound, but they afforded her just enough mobility to hold her violin, to coax out a melody that was heartbreaking in its beauty. I recognize it as the same violin her father had given her as a child. As we approached, I saw the extent of her ordeal. Her clothes were torn, and cuts and bruises marred her exposed skin. As my eyes met Gabby's, I felt a tidal wave of relief and horror wash over me. Her amber eyes, wide, darting, terrified, weren't just focused on me. They were looking past me, above me. Her muffled pleas became more urgent, a sharp sound that twisted my insides like a knife. I knew what she was trying to say. He knew you'd come. He's been expecting you." Turning around, I found myself looking up right into a face I'll never forget. Delacroix, or what had once been a man by that name, was unrecognizable. Towering over us, his form was a grotesque blend of man and beast, with elongated limbs and fur matted with swamp water and grime. His eyes glowed an unnatural phosphorescent green, and his mouth, a gaping maw of jagged teeth, snarled in a symphony of low growls and guttural utterances. He looked less like the werewolves of old myths and more like a creature torn from the pages of an eldritch horror, a monstrous chimera of land and sea creatures, as if the swamp itself had given birth to this aberration. His limbs terminated in claws that resembled twisted tree roots, and tendrils of swamp weed seemed to cling to him, giving him a half-submerged look like a waking nightmare. A rougarou. My fingers tightened around the trigger of my AR, locking eyes with this monstrosity. My mind couldn't process what it was seeing, but my body moved on instinct. Bullets erupted from the barrel, tearing through the humid air toward Delacroix, or Lupin, or whatever unholy name this abomination deserved. Ash's shotgun joined the symphony of violence, both of us emptying our magazines in the span of a few breaths. The bullets struck the beast, but instead of falling, he seemed only to wince, as if we were no more than gnats causing a brief irritation. He lunged, and in a blur of speed and ferocity that defied logic, claws slashed through the air. The claws descended with a speed and force that seemed to defy the laws of physics, raking across my armor and cutting through the material like butter. I moved out of the way quickly enough to prevent the claws from slashing into my flesh. Ash yelled, "Rain, get down," shoving me aside with a force that sent me sprawling into the mud, knocking my night vision goggles off. Ash moved like lightning, his shotgun roaring again, aiming for Lupin's head. "Get away from them," he snarled. Lupin swiveled, his attention drawn by the new threat. The beast lunged at Ash, the two colliding in a whirl of movement too quick to follow with my naked eyes. I heard Ash shout, a primal sound filled with rage and fear as Lupin's claws found their mark. Ash screamed out, a sound of raw agony that pierced my soul. Lupin's claws sank deep into Ash's side, lifting him off the ground as if he were nothing more than a rag doll. With a snarl that echoed in the still night, Lupin flung him. Ash's body arced through the air before crashing into the marsh with a sickening thud. Ash disappeared into the murky water, submerged in a tangle of reeds and shadows. No sound came. No bubbles broke the surface. The marsh seemed to claim him, leaving only ripples that faded into a haunting stillness. Before I could move, Lupin was on me, snarling. With a flick of his monstrous claw, he ripped the rifle from my grasp, the force dislocating my shoulder with a sickening pop. I screamed, more from the horror of what had just happened to my husband than from my own pain. The monster pinned me to the ground, his claws digging into the earth on either side of my head, his foul breath hot against my face. My thoughts were a jumble of fear and revulsion as I lay helplessly beneath Lupin's fuming embrace. He ran his tongue along the nape of my neck. His snout buried itself into my disheveled hair. "Jamon Belle Brune. I love a beautiful brunette," he whispered disgustingly into my ear. I was suddenly aware of his hands tearing at my clothing, his rasping claws stripping me bare, groping my body. In his haste, his claws pricked my skin, sending ripples of pain coursing through me. He seemed to be savoring every moment. The knowledge that this creature meant to do me harm, to corrupt and take pleasure in my suffering before inevitably snuffing out my life, filled me to the brim with an all-consuming rage. With every muscle in my body tensed, my fingers scrabbled across the ground, desperately seeking something, anything, that could turn the tide of this nightmare. Then I felt it, the cylindrical shape of the flashbang grenade still attached to my shredded tactical vest. My dislocated shoulders screamed in agony as I stretched my arm to its limits to grasp the flashbang. I knew the risks. Detonating a flashbang at such close range could cause temporary blindness, maybe even permanent hearing loss for me. But for Lupin, with his heightened senses, the impact would be devastating, possibly lethal. Lupin was so preoccupied with his loathsome acts that he didn't notice as I slid the device into the waistband of his ragged, swamp-soaked trousers. Our eyes met, and a savage grin spread across my face. "Va tu faire foot? Go fuck yourself," I spat out as my thumb yanked the pin free. Time seemed to move in a surreal crawl. Lupin's eyes widened, a glint of realization flickering across his monstrous visage. He released his grip on me, clawing frantically at his waistband, trying to remove the flashbang. But it was too late. The device was armed and seconds away from detonation. Seizing the moment, I pushed myself off the ground with all the strength my battered body could muster, ignoring the sharp pain radiating from my injuries. I stumbled to my feet, sprinting as far away from my attacker as I could. As I ran, I curled into a fetal position, covering my ears and closing my eyes tightly, praying to survive the blast. The stun grenade detonated with a deafening roar, a supernova in the dark swamp. Even through my arms and tightly shut eyes, the light seared my retinas like lightning ripping through the night sky. A shockwave of heat and force rippled through the air, tumbling me further back into the muck. The sound was an unbearable pressure in my ears, as if my head were about to rupture. The world disintegrated into a swirling vortex of blinding light and sound. And then I felt myself sinking into the abyss. Then everything went black. To be concluded in part 6.